Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to it's April, isn't it? April's meeting of the Divorce Support Club with me, Claire Macklin, and Lauren Preedy. And together we provide a safe place for information, guidance, and top tips around all sorts of aspects relating to divorce and separation. And to start up today, we're going to give you some top tips around blending families. And I thought it might be useful before we start for both Lauren and I perhaps to explain a little bit about our kind of personal backgrounds on this, because both of us have personal and professional experience of dealing with blended families. So from my perspective, since my first divorce, which was in 2008, I've had two relationships since then. The first one was with a guy who had two children of his own who were, I think, 3 years and 1 year older than my children. So we had four boys between us, which was interesting. So I've got experience of being both a stepmom to them, although we weren't married, but we lived together half the time. A stepmom to them, and also him being sort of quasi step parent to my children. And then also, once I married for the second time, my children had an official, if you like, stepdad, but there were no other children living in the house. So I've been through this in various different capacities. So Lauren, perhaps if you could just maybe give us a little bit about your situation, just as background before we start.
Yes, yeah, and for those people that don't know me, I'm Lauren Preedy. I'm a solicitor in the divorce and relationships team and deal with separating families and also issues to do with children. But my personal circumstances are that I'm divorced and didn't have children with my ex-husband, but my current partner and I, who have been living together for 4 years, he's got two children who are 10 and 7, and they're with us about a third of the time, including half the holidays as well. So I've had to fall into the role of a step parent. And I've also got experience, of course, in my professional capacity of dealing with families coming together, and also in my friendship group as well with families that have blended. So I think between us, we've got a lot of kind of experience that we hope we can share with you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lauren. So I'm going to share my screen to start. There we go. There we go. So that should have popped out now. So yes, just to add to Lauren's introduction, I'm Claire Macklin. I'm a breakup and divorce coach, a master NLP practitioner. Used to be a lawyer. Been divorced twice now, and I'm now a single mum of two teenage boys or late teenage boys. And I'm also the author of my book, which is Breakup from Crisis to Confidence. So our aims here are to help you concentrate on you and get calm and clarity, and to focus on what you can control, to see kind of options and choices and make positive, informed decisions, communicate more effectively, and ultimately to create a future that you are proud of and enjoy. So blended families. So I thought first it would be really useful just to define what that means. So blended family is one where you and your partner make a life together with children from either one or both of your previous relationships. So I thought what we'd do first is I'm going to whiz through kind of 10 or 12 top tips, and then Laura and I will have much more of a kind of conversation about some of the mistakes that we might have made related to some of these tips and some of the things that we can hopefully pass on to you that can be helpful for your situations. So my first top tip is to take your time. Don't rush this. Get to know each other as separate families first. So perhaps spend some time on days out, spend some time together at your respective homes, all of those things, and take it really slowly. And perhaps even take some advice or some coaching or counselling before you embark on blending your families, because my experience is it never quite goes how you expect it's going to go. And I've also got experience of probably rushing into it a bit too quickly, and it can go horribly wrong when you do that. So secondly, take time to heal from your previous relationship. So this is really important, I think. If you don't allow time for yourself to heal, perhaps from the wounds of your previous relationship, then it's likely that you may well repeat some of the same mistakes or the same patterns. So, in my experience, for example, after my first marriage broke down, I didn't know everything that I know now. And I didn't really allow myself time after the breakdown of my marriage to find out who I really was. So I kind of rushed into quite a rebound type relationship that ultimately made me very unhappy. I took my grief from my first relationship with me into that new relationship and into that new blended family as well. I took that trauma with me. And it meant I didn't identify some of the patterns that I was running that were perhaps unhelpful, or that I was repeating. And I made the same mistakes and then ultimately ended up suffering the same kind of pain when that relationship also broke down. I think it's really important as well to be really honest with yourself about your motivations. So, what is it that you're going into this relationship and this blended family for? And again, I think I've learned this the hard way. So for me, one of the big things at the end of my first marriage was a grief around the loss of my nuclear family. Looking back, I can see quite clearly now that in both of my relationships, subsequently to that, I was looking to recreate the nuclear family that I had lost. So I was looking to replace the father figure in my home, even though my children actually have a fantastic father figure in their own dad, who they see sort of between 40 and 50% of the time anyway. Um, so I was looking for somebody to replace a gap rather than somebody who was perfect for me as a person. And I only really realized this in the last couple of years after doing all my training to become a coach, after working with lots of clients, and after I exited my second marriage as well. So be really honest with yourself about what you're going into this for. Um, and then I think it's really important to discuss what your role actually looks like. So, what is the role of a step parent? How do you want it to look? How does your partner want it to look? Um, the big thing I learned was that this doesn't just necessarily come naturally. Things are much more difficult sometimes than you imagine. There might be very challenging conversations, but it's better to thrash those out before you move in together than afterwards. And I really fell foul of this one with my second marriage. And I thought because he had been a fantastic dad to his own children, that he would find being a stepdad easy, but he didn't. And we really struggled to define what his role was and where the boundaries were. Or looking back, perhaps he struggled to fit in with what I wanted it to be. So it's really important, I think, to have those discussions. What do you want your role to look like? What are the non-negotiable boundaries around it? What's okay? What's not okay? And one of the flashpoints that I often see is around discipline. Particularly when you are alone with your stepchildren, discipline can be a really tricky one. I was massively in the deep end with this one with my first partner after my divorce because he left for work at 6 o'clock every morning, and I had four boys 50% of the time to get ready for school, and they were aged between 3, who was going to nursery, and 8. I also had to do two different school runs, one to one school and one to another school in a different town. So it was really, really challenging. Lots of deep breaths required. It helped that I had the support of their mum. I'll talk about that in a minute, sort of how relationship with your partner's ex-partner, how that can be really helpful. But I remember one of the children saying to me once, well, you can't tell me what to do because you're not my dad. And I remember saying, well, your dad left me in charge in the mornings. I'm the adult here. So actually, yes, you do need to do what I'm asking you to do. So there are sometimes very tricky discussions that come out of that. And I think Lauren will talk about that a little bit later with some of your experiences as well. So parenting styles, be really aware of your differences. So these are really good questions to ask. And what do we agree about? What do we do differently? Can I live with my partner's parenting style? And how do we plan to resolve any differences? So, what's really irritating perhaps on a day out could be really infuriating and frustrating when you have to deal with it every day. So, I think it's really important to talk about how you view being a parent, how your partner views being a parent, and to discuss how you'll handle those times when you might disagree on how to handle something so that you can present a united front to the children. I think it's also worth remembering, though, that even in nuclear families, there will be different parenting styles and there may be conflict about this. What will really matter here is the discussions you have, the ability that you have to listen to each other, support and hear each other, and also being aware of where there are absolute boundaries, absolute no-nos. For example, the use of physicality. Let's move. There we go. Also important, I think, is to remember that this is a really big transition for everybody. So it's really worth checking in regularly with both your partner and all the children, listening really carefully, and don't take it personally when they say something that maybe you didn't want to hear. This can be obviously age appropriate, but one of the things that we used to do in when I was living with my second husband, we used to have regular kind of family check-in meetings. And those family check-in meetings would take place in a cafe or over a meal in a pub and that kind of thing. And we agreed that there was a kind of amnesty. There was an amnesty on getting upset about what somebody else was saying. We agreed that nobody was to talk over each other. Sometimes we had to take a little stone along so that whoever was holding the stone was the person who could speak. And the important thing was that everybody could be heard. And we found that really, really helpful because this is a really big transition for everybody, especially if there is the introduction of new siblings, there's changes of school, and all kinds of other things that are happening. So alongside that, I think it's really important as well to maintain a level of respect for perhaps the other parent and the beliefs and traditions that each family has. So I see a lot of discussions around this on sites like Mumsnet, where a stepmom or dad has perhaps taken their stepchild for a first haircut, or they've taken them to buy a pair of shoes that the other parent doesn't approve of, or they turn up at parents' evening perhaps unexpectedly. The boundaries will differ for different people, so really sound them out. And if you can, create a respectful relationship with the other parent. And I know that's not always possible. So if it isn't possible, just focus on being the very best step parent you can be. Um, some of the some of these things around beliefs can be quite tricky, I think. And I think Lauren, we're going to talk a little bit about this in your experience a little bit later. Um, it might be things like religious beliefs. It might be the different values that you hold, perhaps around education. So my first partner from my marriage was an engineer, and he found it really, really difficult to understand and see the value in education that wasn't vocational. I have a history degree, not hugely vocational, and he struggled really to understand why I would encourage my children to go to university and study whatever subjects they enjoyed, rather than subjects that would be most likely to get them a job. So we used to have some very interesting discussions around this. And we used to have very interesting discussions about this around the dinner table as well. So hopefully you can open up discussion, but I think it's really important to respect particularly strongly held beliefs that each family has. So I think it's really important too to have that family time as well as one-on-one time with your children. Um, don't expect total harmony from day one, if ever. And I guess that's the same with all families. There are ups and downs. There will be hiccups. There will be things that you find tricky. There will be lots of emotions perhaps to navigate. Really don't take it personally if the children don't settle immediately or they behave perhaps in slightly unusual ways, because it's such a huge adjustment to make for everybody. One of the things that I found really, really helpful to help my stepchildren settle in my first relationship was to speak to their mum. I first met her on Christmas Day when I'd been with my partner for maybe a year or so. I'd met the children lots of times, but I'd never met her before. They used to do Christmas together, and I was on my own, so he checked with her whether it was okay and invited me along for Christmas Day too. And interestingly, we got on extremely well right from the get-go. My view has always been that people are just people, and if I like them, I like them. So it didn't matter to me that she was my partner's ex-partner. And actually, she's still one of my best friends now. So I asked her before we moved in together for some advice about what food the children liked, what bedtimes they had, what kind of routines they were used to. And I asked her for anything else that she could tell me that would help them to settle. And I think that was really important. She still says to me today that she really appreciated that. Also be aware that things will change. So being flexible will be really important as the children get older, as their traditions change, as their routines change, things will change. Nothing will stay the same. And that's worth remembering when things feel really tricky. No, it won't stay like that forever. And then it's what you do about it that will make the difference. So some questions that you can ask yourself on a kind of ongoing basis to help encourage that kind of flexibility might be, what's working? And do more of that. What's not working and try and identify the crux of what's not working and what could we do differently. I think it's really important to have those discussions perhaps as a couple, as you're kind of navigating this way through. And actually, you can have those discussions when you're having your family meetings with the children too, if they're old enough to do that. And what do they think is not working? What do they think that you could do differently, or indeed they could do differently? So I think my main message is this is a really moving feast. It can be challenging. It can ultimately be massively rewarding as well. I think what we'll do now is I'm going to stop sharing, and Laura and I will widen the discussion out in terms of some of the experiences that she's had. So, Lauren, could you tell us some of the things that you did perhaps that kind of fit in with these sorts of tips that perhaps helped make the transition easier for your stepchildren?
Yes, yeah, of course. And I think that the points that we're saying about it always being challenging, I think that it's got to be that kind of acceptance that things are always going to come up, and you may have differences of opinions with your own partner, whether you're married or not married, or differences of opinion with the other family as well. So in my circumstances, the children's mum has got a new partner who lives with her as well. And I think one of the things that has started coming up, particularly with um, our 10-year-old, is that there's different things happening in different households. So, for instance, it's been my opinion and my partner's opinion that the children are too young to have TVs in their rooms and they shouldn't have mobile phones at this stage, but they do at their mum's house. And whilst that wasn't a discussion that she'd raised with us, unfortunately, but we're respectful of the fact that if that's a decision she's making, then there isn't anything that we could do about that, and we just have to manage it as best we can in the context of our household. So there is now an understanding that there may be different rules and different things happening in each house. And I think just making sure there's open discussions with that and encouraging the children to be able to talk about whatever they may want to talk about has really worked for us. There's also been and when Claire and I, when we were talking about this, when we were preparing for today, I found a difficult thing arose when my partner wasn't here, and the children had asked some questions about religion because something had come up on a TV program. But I didn't know what to say at that stage because we hadn't had that conversation, and it was the last thing that I was expecting to having to discuss that day. So I had to say, oh yeah, we'll wait till your dad's back and we'll all have a chat about that together. And that's one of the things we were talking about, Claire, wasn't it? To not feel pressured into answering children, but at any age, whether or not they're getting close to being adults or whether they're little ones, to say, oh, just need to have a think about that. I mean, I found it quite easy at the age they're at because they're quite easily distracted. But then actually conversations have now happened about religion and about puberty, which of course with the older one, it's starting to have discussions in school, that my partner and I do have different opinions about some of these things, which we have shared with the children in an age appropriate way, whereas that can be really difficult. And I suppose that then depends upon the maturity of the children and making sure that perhaps if you're not sure about how to deal with those conversations, to perhaps involve the school as well. And actually, it is on my kind of radar with a few things that we're going to have a discussion with their mum as well about certain aspects of things to do with sexual education, for instance. What is she going to be saying about things? So to make sure that as together we're all united on that front.
Yeah, I remember some of those things coming up in my own family as well. particularly when you were saying about different rules and different houses, and I I came across that with my own children too, that at their dad's house they were allowed to do one thing, but at my house they weren't, or vice versa. And I remember always saying to them, I have, there's a rule here, you know what it is. There's a rule at your dad's, you know what it is. There's a rule at your friend's who lives over the road, and you know
Mm,
what it is. And they may all be different. And actually, life is like that. It's not black and white, and it's okay if there are different rules in different places. And I remember having that conversation with my children on a number of occasions. And I suppose that relates into as well the thing about beliefs. It's really good for children to actually sometimes to see that different people may have different beliefs as long as they are spoken about respectfully, and as long as the conversations are open and not trying to think of the right word, that they're not having anything forced upon them.
yeah. And one of the things that I've found challenging, and it's the kind of situation where there might be children's parties or family events or things happening
Mm.
on a day that is not a normal day you would have the children, or vice versa. So we
Yes.
had a situation come up once where their mum had said that they could go to a theatre show via a school, but had not asked us about it first, and we'd already got something booked in the diary that had been booked in and paid for. So of
Mm.
course we then had to be the ones that were disappointing the children by saying they couldn't go, and that could have been an avoidable situation. And
Yeah.
that's where things like our family wizard um,
Yes.
could assist with that. I mean, it's luckily for us only happened on the odd occasion, so there's a bit more of a better dialogue about it. Um,
Mm.
and the other thing that I'm always quite careful of is sometimes decisions are made about clubs and things that have been said to the children without discussion with us, which
Mm.
can be a bit awkward. And I've kind of just taken it on a scenario by scenario basis.
Yeah.
But usually I find things like that aren't kind of in my remit to have to deal with, as usually it'd be my partner that's dealing with that.
Yeah, so that might be one of those occasions where actually for
Yeah.
you to be too involved in that might be one of those occasions when it's overstepping perhaps the role.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I might find something's frustrating for me, but it isn't for the children. So
Mm.
I think that you're entitled to have your own opinion as your own well-being, but of course the welfare of the children is different. So it's kind of then, I suppose, not causing yourself extra tensions or tensions in your own relationship with things that actually um you're better off reflecting on rather than reacting to, I suppose, is the
Yeah.
is
I mean,
the way I think
that's a
about
very
it.
good rule for life in general, isn't it?
Yeah,
Rather than
exactly. Well,
reacting
we
in the
talked
moment.
about exactly.
Yeah,
We
we've
talked
talked
about
about
it
it
on.
lots of times.
I think that comes into most of the conversations we have and the different topics. That there's always that
Mm.
um, time for consideration and reflection, rather than maybe having an upset reaction or an angry reaction.
Yeah,
Um, and then the only other
absolutely.
thing that I also kind of I like the point that you made about the united front. So
Mm.
my partner and I had well, he had a conversation with me that of course if there might be times where I might have said something that he didn't necessarily agree with, but he's never going to call me out on it in front of the children, as in it would be
Mm.
a discussion we would have later if there was something I said that he didn't quite agree with, or I didn't understand something, or and nobody's perfect. We can just do our best.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really interested to find out how did you and your partner have conversations before moving in about what your role was, and especially around that kind of discipline and expectations kind of thing.
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, we were in a slightly odd situation. Is that where the moving in together was kind of happening. It was still we were still within lockdown, so it kind of so I well actually I was in a very lucky position that I got to spend extra time with the children than ordinarily, and was but wasn't involved in like the kind of homeschooling and things, because that was what my partner would do. um and generally speaking, my partner and I have the way that we kind of consider um, dealing with finances and the way we consider like the kind of morals, we're very aligned with that. So certain things we didn't really have conversations about, and as you said, you kind of learn from that. And there was one example I can share where the little one didn't want to wash the shampoo, out of his hair in the bath. And I didn't feel confident to be a bit more forceful to get the shampoo out.
Mm.
So I said to, like, went down, "Oh, Chris, can you come and help with this?" Whereas now
Yeah.
I've been obviously integrated in the family for many years now, so I would feel but they're older, I know, so the scenario is slightly different, but I'd feel confident to be able to deal with that now. Whereas there were certain things I didn't to start with. I didn't know
Mm.
whether I was crossing the line of that or not, and that's kind of been something that's developed between my partner and I.
Yes, and I think you had a conversation with Lev, who sometimes presents with me as well on these, about his
Yes, yeah.
experiences as a man with this, because he also has a stepchild, and he had some other thoughts as well, didn't he, about it?
Yes, yes. Some of the thoughts that he'd had actually. So he has a stepchild, but and also a child with his wife, and actually he's the one that's more disciplined than his wife. So they
Mm.
had a dynamic of actually how would that work, when actually they were fitting in their life together. But actually, when they first got together, they didn't have their own son. So Lev was coming into a situation where he found it easier, as his relationship developed, because he did at the beginning have a bit of the kind of, well, that's not what happens at my dad's house, so he had to deal with that. And we were also talking about the kind of things that come up with, like, if you're like bath time and shower time and things like that. And um, I've always taken the view that I'm obviously, if the kids have barged in on me on the loo or whatever, I'm not cross about it, and like, I'm on the loo, whereas, or in the shower, whereas actually from a male perspective, and not just from Lev but from other friends of mine and things, it's sort of maybe a different dynamic between men and women, whether or not
Mm.
that's because of how you personally feel or how kind of society has sort of um, developed in that respect. But again, I think those conversations are important to have,
Mm.
so that you're not crossing a boundary that somebody feels uncomfortable with.
Mm. Yeah, and that can quite easily happen when you're not expecting it, can't it? So I
Mm,
suppose it's also worth having those discussions about, if a boundary is overstepped, I'm assuming here that it's not a deal breaking boundary. Um, how do you deal with that? How do you sit down and talk about it? And I think what you were saying earlier about your partner saying that he wouldn't call you out in front of the children, but you would talk about it later. And then you can decide what you're going to do
mm,
about it, whether there's something you need to say to the children, or whether there isn't, or whether you just need to do something differently
yeah,
next
yeah.
time, or you know.
And also it works the other way as well. Like, there's been
Mm.
a few occasions where I've actually thought that my partner didn't
Mm.
deal with something in quite the way I would have. So I spoke to him about it afterwards.
Yeah.
And then I suppose you've got to then, both sides of the coin are that you've got to try to not be defensive about it, because that's just a
Yes.
human reaction to especially if you're trying your best. And then
Yeah.
it's like feeling like you're being criticized when you're not, just because it is a difference of opinion. And I think, well, in all these things we talk about, doing the best you can to communicate how you
Yeah.
feel,
Yeah.
I think is got to be the main message there.
Yes. And the point about defensiveness is a really good one. If you can remind yourself, if your partner is saying something that you can see as a criticism, or that they didn't like in something that you did, if you can tune into hearing what their words are, rather than focusing on how I'm going to defend myself at the end of it and what I'm going to say next, and you employ that kind of active listening, that would be really helpful. So being a nice little mantra is to be curious, not furious. So
Oh yeah,
from
that's a
both
good I like
perspectives,
that. Yeah.
it's really
Yeah.
good. Be curious, not furious. So if you're the person who is a bit upset about the thing that your partner's done, be curious about why they did it that way, and be curious about how they were feeling at that time.
Mm,
And if you're the person who's hearing the criticism, say, be curious about why this is so important to your partner. Be curious about what they would prefer to be happening, and then you get into a discussion that isn't attacking and isn't a defensive
mm,
closing down discussion, but can actually become an opportunity for growth
mm,
within both your relationship and also your relationship with the children that are involved too.
And another kind of scenario that I've got that links into the how things can change is when we first lived together, it would be like the children would be arguing over who would sit next to me. And then all of a sudden it changed, and they then were wanting to sit next to daddy, and nobody wanted to sit next to me. So and now it's kind of we have our place at the dinner table. So
Yes.
it's kind of gone from one person to the other person to a kind of neutral dynamics, I suppose.
Mhm.
But again, it's the children, I suppose, settling into to me having been in their lives a bit more.
Yeah.
But I do tend to find that they're on their, if I can't think of a better way of putting it, they're on their dad's side rather than my side. But I'm pleased about that because
Yeah.
it's
There's an innate kind of almost like a blood tie that, and that can
all,
be actually really tricky when you're in a discussion and they're actually talking about their other parent who isn't part of your particular family, and it's their other parents' views that they come up with all the time.
mm,
So my children have done that in the past. So we would be talking about something and they will say, well, dad doesn't agree with you at all about that. He says X, Y, and Z. And that can be really tricky. So I've always taken again a view about being curious around that. Oh, that's really interesting. Perhaps I'll have a discussion with him about that. Or that's really interesting. Would you like to tell me a bit more? Or rather than shutting it down, because what I would never want to do is shut down them being able to talk about their other home in my home.
no, and yeah, and of course that you've always got that kind of age appropriate thing where
Mm,
they might not have quite understood something, or they might be saying something in a very innocent or naive fashion, which out of the context of the conversation is totally different to
yeah,
what was being spoken about. So I suppose it's trying to not speculate about things without
yes.
actually understanding the context of it.
Yes, I have actually sometimes just referred them back to their dad and said, well, I don't really know what dad meant by that. So I'm not sure where he was coming from. So maybe go back and ask him to explain a little bit more to you if you're not sure. Because sometimes they would come and ask me what their dad had meant by something. Well,
Yeah.
I have no idea because I wasn't there.
But I did have we had a funny one where we were playing it was a board game with cards and things, and they yeah pronounced that their dad was the king. So I said, oh well, I'll be the queen, and they're like, no, you can't be the queen because you're not married. It just made me smile that it's like out of the mouths of babes that they kind of
Yes, yeah,
think and say these things as the way that they understand things, but it was quite sweet. So
yeah. Which actually reminds me to ask you about labels. So, you know,
Mhm.
what label do you put on your relationship when you're talking to them about it? How do they understand what your relationship is?
So they understand and have done from the beginning that this is their home as well. Whereas
Mm.
when we first moved in together, their mum's home was referred to as their home, as in
Right.
and they. But now there has definitely been that change of them considering it to be two homes. So that
Mhm.
reference that has changed. But again, that was something that we didn't take offensively. Again, it's just them coming to terms and understanding it as well. And also I've just obviously been Lauren Daddy's girlfriend, but then we did go on a little holiday, and there was a like a little show, and it was like the mums to come up, and the eldest one did then say, oh, but you're a stepmum, so you can come up in this bit. And that's never an expression that we've used, because I'm very conscious and very respectful of how it probably was difficult for their mum when we did move in, because there is the normal human emotions that would come with that. So I've always been very careful about that. And their mum and I have met a couple of times, just because I thought that it was important for us to try to get to know each
Mm.
other. And I suppose the the thing that was different in this scenario, which may not be in other scenarios, is that um, their relationship as husband and wife with the children had broken up a long time before we met.
Right.
So there wasn't any issues of there being a relationship breakdown thrown in the
Mm.
mix, which I can appreciate. The communications could be horrendous to start with and continue to be difficult if a breakdown
Yeah.
was happening at the same time. So we never really labelled that, and that kind of must have just been with conversations in school and TV, and the fact that I find they talk about different families in school, or their friend lives with the granddad, or so I think that the children are very open, and I think the school that they go to as well is very open in the kind of pastoral sense of talking about things like that. So
Yeah, that's really interesting, which actually um, it brings to mind something else as well. So I just wonder whether, how have you been able to integrate perhaps even your wider families as well
mm.
into your situation?
Yeah, so we've found it a bit more difficult to integrate my family, because the kind of my partner would, of course, wants to make sure that the children maintain their relationship with their cousins by blood, if we can
Yeah.
so I'm not confusing how I'm describing it. So of course,
Mm.
because we share the weekends, it can then be difficult. It's difficult basically from a practical sense of fitting
Yeah,
everything in.
it's the
Um,
logistics.
yeah, yeah. And actually, what hasn't happened, which I keep saying now, I think would be a nice thing to happen, especially after all the lockdowns over, is that the kind of so my sister's got two children, roughly the same age, and on my partner's side, his brother has two children, roughly the same age. We've never all met because it just
Mm.
never worked out like that. But actually, that would be a nice thing to do at
Mm.
some point. So I found that a little bit challenging from my own perspective, because I kind of say, well, can we go and visit XYZ? But my partner's preference would be no, because he would rather go and see his family, which I can understand. I can understand that, but sometimes it's just a bit frustrating.
Yeah, I was just think about my own experience of that was there can be other things that can be quite tricky in terms of presents and Christmases and all of those kinds of things. So those are conversations that are it's really important to have early on as well. My mum and dad were always really good when I had my stepchildren here, in that what they did in terms of presents was just give them the same as what they were giving my two. So there wasn't a big disparity in terms of, well, child A and child B have been given, I don't know, £25, and child C and D have been given £500, so that they
Yeah,
were very good at being equal on those terms. And my family were very, very welcoming, which was great.
yeah. Whereas I've had a couple of dynamics that haven't
Mm.
been, um, but the as in so that because they're not my biological children, they haven't been treated in the same way as my brother and sister's children, for instance.
Yeah,
Um, but the children aren't aware of that because it hasn't been in. So, for instance, Christmas presents, they wouldn't know because they weren't there together.
yes, yeah.
Whereas,
So we
so
used to have Christmases all together.
yeah,
Yeah,
so whereas I know that there's that thing that they aren't being treated the same, so I'm sort of containing and dealing with my own emotion
yes,
about that, but the children aren't affected by it.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's really important. There are so many different facets to consider, and I don't know if anybody watching has any questions. If you do have any questions and you'd like to pop them into the chat or the Q&A, Laura and I'd be more than happy to answer them. And hopefully, what we've done today is give you just some insight into our personal experiences in this, and some kind of more general umbrella principles that might be helpful to think of when you're planning to blend two families together, or bring a new partner into the mix.
Mm. And I think it's something that I'm conscious of as we move forward with these sessions, Claire, is that we have talked about boundaries, particularly in one session, and communication, particularly in one session. So what I will do with my team at Ian Walker that help deal with these sessions is for us to try to be able to then give a reference to back to the other session, because
Mm.
we've talked about communication, and um, obviously there may be some good hints and tips that we can try and then say, oh, if you refer to
Yes.
our January session, there's a section on that as well. So I appreciate in future we hopefully will be able to do that.
Yes, as we build up a bigger library,
Exactly,
we
exactly.
month by month of all the sessions that we've got.
Mm.
So all that remains, I think, if there aren't any questions, is to say thank you for those of you who are watching live, and thank you also to those of you who watch on catch up. And we will see you again in May.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody. And if you do have any questions that you want to email to Claire or I, then
Mm.
please feel free to.
Yes, please do. Thank you very much, and we will see you in May.